wait to see my opening hand. Shuffler? Are you there? What is this? Are you kidding me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, so we have to mulligan this, of course. Shuffler? What is happening here? The shuffler is fine! What is this? Yeah, this shuffler sucks. Welcome back everybody to Hazardous Magic. Does the scenario from the introduction seem familiar to you? Is this even possible in Magic, you might ask? Well, today we have an in-depth look at the so-called variance, also known as the shuffler is fine. We'll find out how variance affects your draws, your game plan, your decisions, and especially how you can use a variance for your advantage. But what is this variance? If you ask 3 Magic players about it, you will probably get 4 different answers. From a statistical point of view, the variance is the discrepancy between something that has actually happened versus something that was likely to happen or was expected from you. Yes, I know, this is very hard to swallow. So let's try to dissect this with some examples. Let's assume your deck consists of exactly 60 cards, and 20 of those cards are land cards. Now you draw your starting hand and it contains 4 land cards. You're a little bit wondering, as far as you can remember, that never happened before. Or in other words, what is the probability of that this could happen? Is the shuffler fine? From a statistical point of view, we can easily find that out. All we need is what the statistician calls the hypergeometric distribution. Yeah, I know, sounds intimidating, but fortunately there are some online calculators out there, and of course I will spare you the theoretical background. If you're interested, I will put a link in the description below. So this is the hypergeometric distribution calculator from etherhub.com. I will put a link in the description below as well, so you can try it out on your own. Unfortunately, they use the statistical terminology, so let me guide you through to find out what the likelihood of drawing 4 lands in our starting hand. So, population size is the number of cards in your deck. Yeah, so it's 60. Sample size is the number of cards we want to draw from our deck. So it's our starting hand. So it will be 7. Successes and population is a little bit tricky. It is basically the number of copies of the card in question that we have in our deck. So remember, we got 20 land copies, so we put in 20 to represent that number. Now we have drawn our starting hand and we see 4 land cards. Successes in samples represent how many of those specific cards we want to draw or we have drawn. So the successes in samples will be 4. This is the land cards we have drawn. We click calculate and we see that the chance to draw exactly 4 land cards is 12.4% in our opening hand. So there's even a slightly better chance to draw 4 or more lands in our opening hand. So far, our gut would say it's very unlikely. And this will get confirmed if we sketch the probability curve of drawing 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on lands in our opening hand. So what can we derive from this probability curve? You can spot that our 12.4% chance of drawing 4 lands in our starting hand, it tells you that starting with 5 lands has even less chance to happen, and it is more likely to draw 1, 2, or 3 lands in your opening hand. But there's still a decent possibility that this 4-lander could happen. Roughly, and of course on average, you could expect something like this to happen in 1 out of 10 games. But drawing 5 or more lands is something very unlikely, and experience this will be one of those famous "the shuffler is fine" moments. So what I wanted you to show is that we can expect our starting hand to contain 1, 2, or 3 lands with a combined probability of around 80%, and everything else is something that can happen, what will be more or less unexpected, an outlier you might say, at least from a mathematical standpoint. Now we have seen one example for variance, but in my humble opinion you can find variance in a few different spots throughout Magic the Gathering. You can find variance in cards, in decks, and in the meta itself. So let's start with variance in cards. All cards in Magic the Gathering have an effect. In most cases the effect is well defined. Have a look at Giant Growth. Target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. If you cast this spell, and we keep counterspells and interaction aside, the creature you target will get +3/+3 until end of turn. Pretty predictable, right? And something we would expect. Now let's take a look at the deck of many things. You roll a dice, and based on the outcome of the roll, something happens. You basically know the space of things that could happen, but until you roll that dice, you do not know exactly what will happen. Let us put the thing with the subtract the number of cards in your hand aside, so it's easier to throw down the probability curve. You might have guessed that it is more likely to hit the first 2 modes than the third mode, right? And throughout Magic's history, there are a couple of cards with random effects. These cards are what I call variance cards. But you're lucky. These are easy to control. Just don't play them. And the variance in those cards is the reason why you don't see them, or at least not that often, in tournaments. There is no predictable outcome. As you can see from the deck of the many things probability curve, there's an expectation on what might happen, but if this is going to happen, it's written on another paper, as they say. Another way to look at the variance at the card level is to divide cards in low and high variance cards. This, however, has nothing to do with their randomness, but their usefulness. Low variance cards are considered good in most matchups, as high variance cards are not. Let's have a look at Lightning Bolt. So, Lightning Bolt is one of the most famous Magic cards for a reason. This card is good in every single matchup. Either you kill the early creature drops of your opponent, or you direct 3 damage straight to face. In fact, the card is so good that it restricts the formats it's in. If Lightning Bolt is allowed in a format, the usefulness of creatures is measured if they can survive a Lightning Bolt or not. Basically the card that is never dead in your hand. You would say it is consistent. Now let's have a look at Blue Elemental Blast. The card is excellent against certain matchups, but terrible in others. What happens if your opponent does not play any red cards? Yep, it will sit in your hand until you discard it or the game is over. So you might have already guessed correctly, low variance cards end up in main boards, and high variance card end up in sideboards, and are sideboarded in when the matchup is good for them and makes the card a low variance card in a specific matchup. Now let's have a look at your deck, and you can trust me, the deck itself has a lot of variance. First of all, the initial shuffling. Then, what does your starting hand look like? And do you have to mulligan because of your starting hand? What are your draws throughout the match? And each time you cast a spell that shuffles your library. And yeah, the same is true for your opponent. Actually, this is what Magic makes so spicy and yes, sometimes frustrating. As you will see, variance is a double-edged sword. You can have the special winning streak because the shuffler likes you and lets you combo off every time. Or you have this losing streak because the shuffler is fine in another way, you know? The most frustrating thing is when the good side and the bad side of variance come together. Your draws are quite terrible and something that is very unlikely to happen happens. And the top decks of your opponents are quite God mode activated. Yes, this is frustrating and you need some time to recover after that. Now the good and the bad thing. You can influence but not control the variance of your deck. Number 1. Don't put in cards with random effects. Yes, we already covered that. Cards with random aspects are probably the most fun to play and they will see a lot of play, but not in tournaments. Number 2. Put in cards with low variance. High variance cards are for sideboards. We already covered that as well. Number 3. Add 4 copies of vital cards to increase your chance to actually draw them. Number 4. Include copies of cards that have similar effects to make your deck more consistent. We will cover this in a few seconds. And number 5. Think about your mana base to minimize mana flood and mana screw. So number 1 and 2 were already addressed previously. Number 5, designing your mana base, is a topic on its own and would exceed the content of this video. So I will cover this in the future. So basically we need to discuss point 3 and 4. So what happens if you put more and more copies of a card into your deck? Of course, to a maximum of 4. As you can see from this curve, adding additional copies drastically increases your chance to draw at least 1 copy. You can use this insight to your advantage when building your deck. You put in 4 copies, so and this is the green curve, when a card is essential for your deck to function properly, and you want to see this card in your opening hand, and you do not mind if you draw multiple copies while the game lasts. As you can see, you have a 30% chance to get at least 1 copy in your starting hand and around 55% after you have drawn 3 additional cards. After you have drawn 20 additional cards, this is here. From one note from my side, these 20 cards include your 7 or 8 cards from your starting hands. So this should be around turn 15. You will pretty reliably hit at least 1 copy. You put in 3 copies, which is the yellow curve. If you want to see that card at some point in the mid game, but you prefer not to draw multiple copies of this card. So this is basically mostly for situational cards. You put in 2 copies of a card, so this is the red curve. If the card is not vital to your overall strategy, or the card is expensive to cast and you do not necessarily want to see 2 copies of it in your starting hand, or this is your win condition for the late game. As you can see from the probability curve, there's a decent 76% chance to hit 1 copy after drawing 30 cards. So this should be around turn 25. And you put in 1 card, so this is the blue curve. If this card functions as your very late game finisher, or you have other ways to tutor the card out of your library, and 1 copy is enough to decide the match. As you can see, even after drawing 20 cards, the chance to draw 1 copy is still very low and only around 33%. Now let's see what happens if you put 4 copies of a card into our deck that is pretty similar to one of our 4-offs, like having Wrath of God and Day of Judgment in a deck to reliably sweep the board. As you might have guessed, this pretty much doubles the chance to see at least 1 copy in our starting hand. So, and in this particular case, we want to sweep the board early and often. Like cards, a deck can have a high or low variance. A deck with a high variance can go off like crazy or can be totally cold if you draw the wrong cards. Typically, those high variance decks are combo decks. You can, and from time to time, you will draw the wrong half of your library. To make combo decks work, you need tutors and card draw spells to increase the consistency by reducing the variance. Another good example is the commander deck, a 100 card deck where only one copy per card is allowed. I guarantee you no match will be like the other, and this is by design. Kitchen table magic should be fun, and every match should feel different, even playing the same deck over and over and over again. In kitchen table magic, it's the experience that counts, or at least should, and not if you win or lose. On the other hand, a deck with a low variance has more or less the same experience every game. It's like mono-white aggro these days. You draw your powerful creatures and you turn them sideways. These low variance decks are called consistent, and this is what we aim for when we build a deck. We want to minimize our variance, to raise our consistency, to keep our win rate high. Now let's dive into some real-world examples on how to use probabilities and variance to your advantage. Let's assume you're playing mono-green aggro and you already have a nice board state. Your opponent is playing mono-black control. Next turn you have lethal if you play the trampler this turn. You know that this particular deck that your opponent plays contains 4 Meatok Massacres and 4 Blood on the Snow. Besides his starting hand, your opponent has drawn 8 additional cards and would be able, of course mana-wise, to cast one or the other to sweep the board. Should you cast the trampler? Think about it. Probably not. Because you know there's a 92% chance that they already have a sweeper in hand, just waiting to punish you. You could force him to have it or lose the game, but regarding from the sheer expectation and probability, you will be probably regret it. Even with just 4 copies, the risk is quite high. So, and in Magic, is a game of risks. Take it or leave it. Now you will be asking, how am I going to remember all those probabilities? Well, yes, good question. You will, over time. For now, just screenshot the slide with the probability curves and print it out. If you use these on a daily basis, you will get used to them. Trust me. Now we are adjusting the previous example. Let's assume that we know our opponent's hand and there's no board wipe in it. How likely is it for them to top deck it? Remember, besides their starting hand of 7 cards, they have already drawn 8 cards. And they have 4 Blood on the Snow and 4 Meatok Massacre in the deck. So, the population size is not 60 this time, it is 45, which is the size of our library in the beginning, minus the 15 cards our opponent has drawn so far. Then they will top deck 1 card. We know they have 4 Meatok Massacres and 4 Blood on the Snow in their deck. And the 1 card should be one of the 8 sweepers. So, and then we press calculate, and it's a chance of 17.8% that they top deck what they need to wipe the board right now. Another example. You're in the middle of an intense game. It's at turn 10 now. While your opponent is able to improve his board state, you have drawn nothing but lands for the last 4 turns. And you are falling behind pretty quickly. You have already played 6 lands since you started to draw nothing but lands. Your deck consists of 24 land cards. Is this one of the famous shuffle is fine moments? So for the calculation, we assume that we are on the play. The population size is 60 minus 7 because of our starting hand, minus 6 because it's turn 10 now, and everything happened 4 turns earlier. So this is actually 47. We have drawn 4 cards that were nothing but lands. We have 24 land cards in our deck, but already played 6 of them, so it's 18. And all of the 4 cards that we have drawn were land cards. So let's see what is the probability for this. And we see the probability to draw 4 land cards out of 4 drawn cards is 1.7%, which is quite low. So we can assume this is one of the shuffler is fine moments. Now let us turn around the scenario. What is the chance that we were not able to draw any lands in the last 4 turns? So this is pretty easy because everything stays the same, and the only thing that we need to change is the successes in sample. So instead of 4, we put in a 0 and find out what is the chance for us to draw 0 lands out of 4 card draws. And we see actually there's a decent chance, around 13.3%, to actually that could happen to us. But I would say it's more or less the shuffle is fine moment as well. Actually, this kind of analysis is only useful after the game because it's obviously not helpful during the game. Something like this just happens. But it might be beneficial after the game to find out if this is something that you have to expect from your deck, or if this just happened because of variance, or in this particular case, also known as bad luck. Last but not least, we have the meta variance. Ever try to pick a deck from untapped.gg or another MTG deck source and try to replicate those win rates? Let's try it out. We go to the tile list and I've picked mono red goblins and go for 100 and plus matches to have even more variance, and copy it to Magic the Gathering Arena, and I'll see you in a couple of seconds. Couple of seconds for you, around 50 minutes for me. Played 10 games, got 50% win rate. Can you remember the win rate from the copy deck? It was around 61%. What happened to me? Why I've got a worse win rate? So decks from those sides have normally seen a lot of games and the win rate already stabilized. Now you play a few games and a lot of things might go wrong. The matchmaker might send you against Izzet turns 4 times in a row and you lose each game because the deck has a very bad matchup against Izzet. Some games you get mana flooded or mana screwed, you quite don't draw the answers you need, you get mirrored all the time and your opponent draws are just better than yours, and so on and so on and so on. In the end, you maybe win 5 games out of 10, which puts you to a win rate of 50%. Is the deck bad? Probably not. So many people played it and the results got tracked. So what happened to me? Variance, of course. If I would play 100 games, I should see my win rate stabilize as well, and trend towards the win rate that you have seen on the side. Unless I'm playing very bad on purpose, right? The takeaway, you should not be afraid of losing. I can promise you, even with the best deck in the world, you will lose because of variance. Sometimes. Remember, the best players in the world have lost more matches than you have ever played. Unless you're one of those pros, of course. Now you pick a deck from a content creator. They only play a couple of matches, though the so-called sample size, also known as the number of matches, is very small, and so variance might be very high. So the average win rate hasn't stabilized yet, and the deck creators and your win rate will normally have a large gap. The games they are showcasing might just only be the games where they got lucky in drawing all the answers they needed. And you might get not so lucky and lose a lot of games. The other way around will probably not happen because the content creators do not showcase bad decks, you know. From time to time they will probably play a deck that performs very bad, but you will never see this deck because it will not be uploaded to YouTube. By the way, this is why claiming 100% win rate in video titles is total BS. And will only lead to a lot of frustration for unexperienced players. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed the content. If yes, please like and subscribe. It does you cost nothing and means a lot to me. See you next time. Over and out.